All right, so our goal here is to really now kind of dive into the nitty-gritty details of modeling a recession and then eventually an expansion. So how does the business cycle work using our labor market model? So we're going to start with a recession and think what it looks like. And we're going to go back to something we talked about before, which was downward wage rigidity. So before I get there, one thing I want to kind of remember, okay, so a recession we just decided was caused by a decrease in labor demand. So we'll get into some specific reasons why this happens. But one thing I want you to remember is that what determines labor demand was this value of marginal product. So if you worked on the exam recently, we had all this stuff about calculating the value of the marginal product. And that was the price times what we call the marginal product of labor. So if labor demand goes down, it's either because the price went down or the marginal product of labor went down. And so we'll eventually think of explanations for what would cause the marginal product of labor to go down. We'll have different explanations by different theories of the business cycle, but it's just kind of worth remembering what determines labor demand is the value of the marginal product, right? How valuable is an additional employee to my company in terms of the additional revenue they'll bring in? And the additional revenue they'll bring in is the price of the good times the number of extra goods that worker can make. When that's equal to the wage, that tells me the quantity of labor demanded. Okay, so let's get into a description here of a recession. So I'm going to call L, that's my labor. W is my wage. And so I have labor supply and I have labor demand. So I'm going to start us off in a pretty good spot here where employment is pretty close to as high as it could be. And there we go. And now we're going to have a recession, which is a decrease in our demand for labor. So labor demand is going to shift to the left. This will be LD2. So something changed that caused the value of the marginal product to decrease. Now, if we have what I call perfectly flexible wages, so I'm going to start with the flexible wage case. All that means is that the wage rate can adjust and go down. And so just what we saw in the last graph, employment is going to go down, and that is going to cause GDP to go down. Pretty straightforward with the flexible wage. And so we get a decrease in employment, a decrease in real GDP. Now, downwardly rigid wages, what that implies is that the wage rate can't actually decrease. So we're going to stay at W1. Sorry, downward rigid, if I can spell here, rigid wage. We're stuck at W1, at least in terms of a decrease. The wage can't go down. And so what happens then is we tend to get a much larger decrease in employment. So the decrease in employment is much larger. Instead of going to L2, we go to L3. And because employment goes down by more, that means the decrease in real GDP is much larger. And so having a downward rigid wage causes our economic contraction or recession to be much larger. Now, the other important part is that notice this creates some unemployment, additional unemployment. Right, so these are people that are involuntarily unemployed. So at the current wage, W1, the number of people that want to work is L1. That's the quantity of labor supplied when the wage is W1. However, only L3 of those people actually get to work. So the difference, L1 minus L3, is all an increase in unemployment. Those are people that are involuntarily unemployed. I want to work at this wage, but I'm unable to because there isn't sufficient labor demand. And so the downward rigid wage allows us to also explain the big increases in unemployment that we see in recessions, right? And so, it's kind of an interesting question to think about, well, why would the wage be downwardly rigid? And it turns out that, for whatever reason, firms are hesitant to decrease wages in the sense that they would rather tend to lay off workers rather than decrease wages. Now, why is that exactly? So, you can imagine a place that has 2 people working there. All right. And so you have a recession that decreases labor demand. So I only want to hire 1 worker. That's my quantity of labor demanded, is I only need 1 worker. And so at the current wage, right? So what can I do? Well, I could decrease both workers' wages by 50%. So you both take home half as much, but you both get to continue working. Or I can lay off 1 worker and let the other worker maintain at the current wage. So you can imagine, 1 worker may feel that they're more valuable than the other one. And so you say, well, you can take a 50% wage cut, or we can see who's going to get laid off. In some sense, the workers might be willing to take the bargain, or at least from the employer's perspective, I can either make everyone mad by giving them a 50% wage cut, or I can make 1 person mad who's not going to work for me anymore and leave the other people that are working for me at least happier than they would be with the 50% wage cut. So there's lots of theories like that for why the wage is downwardly rigid, but it does appear to be the case. So firms tend to go towards layoffs as opposed to reducing wages in response to these downturns. And so that's exactly what we see happening here. And we can kind of see how that rigid wage is going to make the recession worse. A bigger decrease in employment, a bigger decrease in GDP, and thus we get this increase in unemployment of the involuntary type. Okay, and so what we're going to do next in the next video is to then look at, how does the economy recover? And we'll walk through some different possibilities.